My sister took my fiancé, my dress, and my wedding date, but she couldn't take my karma. I used to believe that blood was thicker than water. I used to believe that sisters were forever, that family meant something sacred, something that couldn't be broken by jealousy or greed or the kind of darkness that lives quietly inside people until the right moment arrives for it to emerge. I believed in a lot of things back then, before the day I walked into my childhood home and saw my wedding dress hanging in my sister's closet instead of mine. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I lost everything I thought mattered, only to discover what actually did. Melissa and I grew up in a small house on Maple Street, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, and privacy was just a word people used but never really practiced. We were only 18 months apart. Irish twins, as our mother used to say with that tired smile she wore like a uniform. She was older, taller, prettier, according to the way our relatives would coo over her at family gatherings, while I stood beside her like a shadow that had somehow learned to smile on command. She had our mother's bone structure, the kind of cheekbones that caught light like they were designed for it, and hair that fell in natural waves, while mine required an hour with a straightening iron to look halfway decent. But I never resented her for it. That's the truth, even now, even after everything. I loved my sister the way you love someone who's been woven into every memory you have. Every birthday cake and scraped knee and late-night whisper session when our parents were fighting downstairs and we'd hold hands under the covers and promise each other that we'd never be like them. We'd never hurt each other. We'd always be honest. We'd always choose each other first. I met David at a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of meeting that feels accidental until you look back and realize that maybe some things are meant to find you exactly when you need them most. I'd just been laid off from my job at the marketing firm, one of those corporate restructuring situations where they tell you it's not personal, while simultaneously making it the most personal thing that's ever happened to you. I was sitting in the corner with my laptop, updating my resume and trying not to cry into my latte, when this man sat down at the table next to mine and said, completely unprompted, that he hoped whatever I was working on went better than his morning had. We talked for 3 hours. He was an architect, recently moved to town for a project renovating the old courthouse downtown. He had kind eyes and an easy laugh, and this way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd heard all day. By the time we exchanged numbers, I'd forgotten all about the job I'd lost. I felt like maybe I'd found something more important instead. Melissa met David 2 weeks later at a family dinner my mother insisted on hosting, even though I'd told her I wasn't ready to introduce anyone yet. But my mother had always been pushy about these things, always worried that I'd end up alone, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I needed to be more like Melissa, who'd had boyfriends since she was 15 and knew how to flirt and charm and make men feel like they'd won something just by being in her presence. So David came to dinner, and Melissa was there with her latest boyfriend, Marcus, and we all sat around my parents' dining room table, eating pot roast and pretending we were the kind of family that did this sort of thing naturally. Melissa was charming that night, the way she always was. She asked David about his work, laughed at his stories, complimented his watch and his haircut, and the way he'd help my mother bring dishes to the table without being asked. I remember feeling proud, watching them get along, thinking how lucky I was to have a sister who welcomed the man I loved instead of competing for his attention the way I'd seen other sisters do. Marcus seemed bored, checking his phone under the table, but Melissa was radiant, alive in that way she got when she had an audience, and David seemed genuinely delighted by her. After that dinner, Melissa started calling more often. She'd want to meet for lunch, just the two of us, sister time, she called it. She'd ask about David, how things were going, whether I thought he was the one. I'd tell her everything, because that's what sisters do, isn't it? You share your joy, your fears, your hopes for the future. I told her how David had started talking about marriage, how he'd asked casual questions about what kind of wedding I'd want, what kind of life I imagined for us. I told her about the house we'd looked at together, the 3-bedroom colonial with the big backyard and the kitchen that got morning light. I told her I'd never been this happy, this certain about anything in my entire life. She'd smile and squeeze my hand and say she was so happy for me, that I deserved this, that David was lucky to have me. And I believed her, because why wouldn't I? She was my sister. We'd promised each other honesty. We'd promised each other loyalty. We'd promised each other everything that mattered. 6 months after that dinner, David proposed. It was simple, perfect, exactly what I would have wanted if I'd been able to articulate it. We were walking through the park where we had our third date, and he stopped by the fountain and got down on one knee and said that meeting me had been the best accident of his life. The ring was vintage, an emerald-cut diamond that had belonged to his grandmother, and when he slid it onto my finger, I felt like every hard thing I'd ever been through had been leading me to this exact moment. Melissa was the first person I called, before my parents, before my friends, before anyone else. I called her and I was crying and laughing at the same time, and I said, "He proposed, Mel! He actually proposed!" And she screamed with joy and said she was coming over right away, that we needed to celebrate, that this was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to either of us. She brought champagne, and we drank it straight from the bottle like we were teenagers again, and we talked about wedding plans and bridesmaids' dresses, and she said of course she'd be my maid of honor, that she'd been waiting her whole life for this. We stayed up until 3 a.m. looking at venues on my laptop, and when she finally left, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe and whispered that she loved me more than anything. I had no idea that was the last honest moment we'd ever share. The first crack appeared so subtly I almost missed it. David started working late more often, which wasn't unusual given the courthouse project was entering its final phases. But there was something different about the way he'd mention it, a hesitation in his voice when I'd ask if he wanted me to bring him dinner at the office, a quick change of subject when I'd suggest we plan a weekend away to celebrate our engagement properly. I told myself I was being paranoid, that wedding planning stress was making me see problems where none existed. Melissa, meanwhile, had become my constant companion in the planning process. She'd taken on the maid of honor role with an enthusiasm that surprised even me. Every morning she'd text with new ideas, venues she'd found, florists who specialized in the kind of wildflower arrangements I'd mentioned wanting. She'd insist on coming to every appointment, every dress fitting, every cake tasting. At first, I was grateful for her involvement, touched that she cared so much about making my day perfect. My mother commented on it too, said it was beautiful to see us so close, that she'd always hoped we'd maintain this kind of bond into adulthood. But there were moments that felt off, small things that I'd push away because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging something I wasn't ready to face. The way Melissa would touch David's arm when she was making a point, letting her hand linger just a second too long. The inside jokes they developed about wedding traditions, laughing together while I stood slightly outside their circle of shared amusement. The time I came back from the bathroom at a restaurant and found them deep in conversation that stopped abruptly when I sat down, both of them smiling at me with expressions that felt rehearsed. I chose my wedding dress on a Tuesday in March, 4 months before the wedding date we'd set for July 15th. It was at a boutique Melissa had found, an elegant place with champagne and soft lighting, and a consultant who treated every bride like she was royalty. The dress was perfect, an A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves and a train that moved like water. When I stepped out of the dressing room, Melissa's eyes filled with tears, and she said I looked like something out of a fairy tale. The consultant agreed, said the dress had been made for me, that some brides search for months, but when you find the right one, you just know. I put down a deposit that day, arranged for alterations, marked the date for the final fitting in my calendar with little stars around it. Melissa took photos of me in the dress, said she wanted to remember this moment forever, that she'd show them to her future children someday and tell them about the day their Aunt Sarah found her perfect dress. I was so happy I could barely speak on the drive home, just kept looking at my engagement ring and thinking about how in 4 months I'd be wearing that dress and walking down an aisle toward the man I loved. 2 weeks later, I stopped by Melissa's apartment unannounced. She'd been sick, or said she was, canceling our usual Thursday lunch and a bridesmaid dress shopping trip we'd planned. I'd picked up soup from her favorite place and some magazines I thought she'd enjoy, wanting to check on her the way sisters do.
I had a key to her apartment from the time she'd gone on vacation and needed me to water her plants, and I used it when she didn't answer my knock, calling out that I'm here and bringing surprise. The apartment was quiet, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd gone out despite being sick. But then I heard voices from her bedroom, low and intimate, and I froze in the entryway with the soup container still in my hands. My brain couldn't process what I was hearing at first, couldn't make sense of the male voice that sounded familiar mixed with Melissa's laugh, that particular laugh she used when she wanted someone to think she was charming and available and interested. I should have left. Every instinct I had told me to turn around, walk out, pretend I never been there. But instead, I moved toward her bedroom like I was being pulled by something outside my control, each step feeling like I was walking underwater, everything slow and muffled and surreal. The door was slightly open, and through the gap, I could see them sitting on her bed, close together, his hand on her thigh, her head tilted toward him in that way that meant intimacy, meant secrets, meant things that were supposed to be private. It was David. Of course it was David. Some part of me had known it from the moment I heard the voices. But seeing it was different, was final, was the kind of knowing that changes the entire structure of your reality. They weren't kissing, weren't doing anything that couldn't technically be explained away, but I'd been with David long enough to recognize the body language of desire, of connection, of two people who'd crossed lines they weren't supposed to cross. I must have made a sound, some small gasp or movement, because they both turned toward the door simultaneously. The expression on Melissa's face wasn't guilt or shame or even surprise. It was calculation, I realized later. The look of someone who'd been caught before they were ready but was already formulating the story they'd tell. David, at least, had the decency to look horrified, to stand up quickly and say my name like a question, like he couldn't believe I was real standing there in the doorway of my sister's bedroom. The soup container slipped from my hands and hit the floor, tomato basil spreading across Melissa's white carpet in a stain that looked like blood. Nobody moved to clean it up. We all just stood there, frozen in this moment that would define everything that came after. And I felt something inside me crack so completely I knew it would never fully heal. You know, sometimes we go through storms not to drown, but to finally see who was never meant to sail with us. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, you're not alone. Stay with me, subscribe, and share your story in the comments because your voice deserves to be heard.
I don't remember leaving Melissa's apartment. One moment I was standing in her doorway staring at the soup stain spreading across her carpet, and the next I was sitting in my car 3 blocks away with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't grip the steering wheel properly, and I kept thinking about ridiculous things, like how I'd need to replace that soup container because it had been my favorite one, the one my grandmother had given me years ago. Grief does that to you, I learned. It makes you focus on the small losses because the big ones are too enormous to comprehend all at once. David called 47 times that first day. I know because I counted them later, scrolling through my phone in the dark at 3 a.m. when sleep had become something other people did. He left voicemails that started apologetic and gradually became defensive, explanatory, then angry at my silence. He said it wasn't what it looked like, that Melissa had been upset about her breakup with Marcus, and he'd just been comforting her. He said I was overreacting, that if I just let him explain, everything would make sense. He said he loved me, that nothing had happened, that I was throwing away our future over a misunderstanding. But I'd seen his hand on her thigh. I'd seen the way they'd been sitting together, the intimacy in that small space between their bodies. And more than that, I'd seen Melissa's face, that calculated expression that told me this wasn't the first time, wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't anything close to innocent. So I didn't answer his calls, didn't read his texts, didn't open my door when he showed up at my apartment at midnight demanding that I talk to him like an adult. Melissa didn't call at all, which somehow hurt more than David's desperate attempts at explanation. She sent a single text message 2 days after I'd found them together. "We need to talk. You're not being fair." As if fairness had anything to do with what I'd witnessed, as if I was the one who'd betrayed decades of sisterhood and trust.
I blocked her number and then immediately unblocked it, some pathetic part of me still hoping she'd apologize, admit what she'd done, beg for forgiveness, even though I had no idea if I could give it. My mother called on day 5, her voice tight with the particular strain she got when she was trying to manage a situation she didn't fully understand. Melissa had told her there'd been a fight, that I'd misinterpreted something innocent and was refusing to listen to reason, that I was being dramatic and hurtful and potentially ruining my own wedding over nothing. My mother suggested I talk to a therapist, said that pre-wedding jitters were normal, that I shouldn't let my insecurities destroy something good. She didn't ask for my side of the story, I noticed. She'd already decided which version she believed. I told my mother I was canceling the wedding. The words came out flat, emotionless, like I was reading someone else's script. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then she said, very carefully, that I should think about this more seriously, that calling off a wedding was a big decision, that David was a good man from a good family, and I might not get another chance like this. She didn't say I might not get another chance because I wasn't as pretty or charming as Melissa, but I heard it anyway, in the spaces between her words, in the emphasis she put on certain phrases. Canceling a wedding, it turns out, is almost as much work as planning one. Vendors need to be contacted, deposits fought over, invitations unsent. The venue was sympathetic but firm about their no refund policy. The caterer offered to transfer our contract to another date, as if I'd want to use the same menu for some hypothetical future wedding to someone who hadn't betrayed me. The florist actually seemed relieved, said she'd been worried about sourcing enough wildflowers for the arrangements I'd wanted, and now she could take a more profitable booking. I kept the dress. I don't know why exactly, except that I'd paid for it, and it was mine, and at least one thing from this disaster was going to belong to me alone. It hung in my closet in its white garment bag, a ghost of the future I'd imagined, and sometimes late at night I'd stand in front of it and try to remember what it had felt like to be the woman who'd chosen it, who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings, and sisters who kept their promises. 3 weeks after I'd found them together, my landlord informed me that my lease wasn't being renewed. It was a month-to-month arrangement and perfectly legal, but the timing felt suspicious, felt orchestrated. I learned later that David had gone to school with my landlord's son, that they were friends, that favors had been called in. I was being pushed out, systematically isolated, and there was a kind of strategy to it that made me realize this wasn't just about an affair, wasn't just about betrayal. This was about erasing me entirely, making room for whatever story they'd decided to tell instead. I moved into a studio apartment on the bad side of town, the kind of place with thin walls and questionable plumbing and neighbors who screamed at each other at 2 a.m. I'd lost my job months ago, and my savings were disappearing into cancellation fees and moving costs and the basic necessities of starting over. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches and told myself this was temporary, that I'd find work soon, that I'd rebuild. But mostly, I just felt numb, like I was watching my life happen to someone else from very far away. I'd wake up each morning and spend several seconds trying to remember why I felt this heavy weight on my chest before the memories would crash back in, sharp and immediate and relentless. My sister and my fiancé, my family choosing her story over mine, my entire future deleted like a file that had never really existed at all. I stopped answering the phone entirely, stopped checking social media, stopped existing in any public way. I became a shadow of myself, and for a while I thought maybe that was all I'd ever be again.
The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, exactly 2 months after I'd walked into Melissa's apartment and found my life waiting to be dismantled. It was heavy, expensive cardstock, with calligraphy so elaborate it looked like art. And for several long moments, I just stared at it, without opening the envelope, knowing somehow what was inside, but needing to see it with my own eyes before I could believe it was real. Melissa Catherine Morrison and David James Chen request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration on July 15th. My wedding date. The date I'd chosen. The date I'd put deposits down for. The date that was supposed to be mine. They'd taken it, reused it like it was just another recyclable commodity.
Like those months of planning and dreaming and hoping had been nothing more than a rough draft they could improve upon. The venue was the same one I'd booked. The time was the same. Even the wording of the invitation echoed conversations Melissa and I had had about formal versus casual phrasing, about whether to include a religious reference, about how to make guests feel welcomed without being presumptuous. She'd copied my wedding almost exactly, improved upon it with her better taste and bigger budget, and was inviting me to watch her live the life that was supposed to be mine. I should have thrown the invitation away. Any rational person would have torn it into small pieces and tried to move forward, tried to let go, tried to find some way to make peace with the situation. But something shifted in me as I sat there in my tiny studio apartment with its stained carpet and broken air conditioning, holding this heavy piece of cardstock that represented everything I'd lost. I felt something I hadn't felt in months, something that wasn't numbness or grief or the dull ache of acceptance. I felt angry. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns itself out quickly, but something colder, more calculated, the kind of anger that clarifies rather than clouds. For 2 months, I'd been the victim in this story, the woman who'd been betrayed and abandoned and systematically erased. I'd let myself be small, had accepted the narrative that I was overreacting, that I was difficult, that I should be grateful for having been chosen at all, even temporarily. But sitting there with that invitation in my hands, I realized something important. I didn't have to keep playing that role. The first thing I did was stop hiding. I reactivated my social media accounts and changed my profile picture to a photo from a hiking trip I'd taken the week before. My face sun-flushed and genuinely smiling, no makeup, no pretense, just me looking happy and alive. I didn't post anything about the breakup or the upcoming wedding or my feelings about any of it. I just existed publicly again, visible and present and refusing to disappear just because it would make things easier for everyone else. The second thing I did was call the wedding venue. I spoke to the event coordinator, the same woman I'd worked with months ago when this had been my wedding we were planning. I was pleasant, professional, asked how preparations were going for the Morrison Chen wedding on July 15th. There was a brief pause, and then she said preparations were going well, though there had been some complications with deposits and contracts that she wasn't at liberty to discuss. I said I understood completely, that I just wanted to make sure everything was perfect for my sister's special day, and wasn't it wonderful how everything had worked out? I could hear the awkwardness in her voice, the careful neutrality of someone who'd been put in an impossible position. She didn't know the full story probably, or had heard only the version Melissa and David had told, the one where I was the unstable ex who'd freaked out over nothing. But I'd planted a seed of doubt, a small question about the ethics of what had happened. And sometimes that's all you need to start growing something larger. The third thing I did was reach out to Marcus, Melissa's ex-boyfriend who'd been at that family dinner all those months ago. I'd remembered his boredom, the way he'd checked his phone under the table, and I wondered if maybe he'd seen something I'd missed, or if he had his own story about why their relationship had ended. I found him through mutual friends on social media and sent a simple message. I hope you're doing well. I'm sorry about how things ended with Melissa. I'd love to buy you coffee sometime if you're willing to talk. He responded within an hour. I've been waiting for someone to ask. When and where? We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where people go to have conversations they don't want overheard. Marcus looked better than he had at that dinner, more relaxed, like he'd shed some weight that was pressing down on him. He ordered black coffee and didn't waste time with small talk. He said, "So you figured it out? About David?" It wasn't a question. I nodded, and something in my expression must have told him everything he needed to know because he leaned back in his chair and said, "She started cheating on me with him about 2 weeks after that dinner at your parents' house. I found text between them, him asking when she'd be free, her saying she needed to be careful because her sister was getting suspicious. I confronted her, and she said I was paranoid, that David was just being friendly, that I was ruining her relationship with you by making accusations. Then she broke up with me and told everyone I'd been controlling and jealous. Sound familiar?" It did. It sounded exactly like the story I'd been living, and sitting there listening to Marcus describe his own version of it, I realized this wasn't about love or chemistry or two people who couldn't help falling for each other. This was a pattern, a calculated series of actions, and I'd been so focused on my own pain that I hadn't seen the bigger picture. Marcus had receipts, screenshots of texts, dates and times, evidence that the affair had started months before I'd discovered it, that Melissa had been planning this systematically while pretending to help me plan my wedding. He handed me his phone and said I could take pictures of whatever I wanted, that he'd been hoping someone would eventually ask, that the truth deserved to see daylight. I photographed everything. Every text message, every timeline inconsistency, every piece of evidence that proved this wasn't a love story, but a calculated betrayal. And as I worked through Marcus's phone, documenting months of lies, I felt that cold anger in me solidify into something else, something more like purpose. I'd been knocked down, erased, made invisible, but I wasn't gone, not yet. And I was going to make sure that when the truth finally came out, it would be impossible to ignore.
The week before the wedding, I went to the bridal shop where I'd bought my dress. The same consultant was working, and she recognized me immediately, her face showing that particular expression people get when they're trying to figure out how to navigate an awkward situation without making it worse. I smiled at her, warm and genuine, and said I needed to pick something up from my sister's order. There'd been a small misunderstanding with the alterations, nothing serious, but Melissa had asked if I could handle it since she was so busy with final preparations. The consultant hesitated, clearly uncertain, but I had Melissa's credit card information from months ago when we'd been shopping together, and she'd saved it to my phone, just in case. I showed her the confirmation number for Melissa's dress alterations, spoke confidently about hem lengths and bustle styles, and eventually the consultant's professionalism overrode her skepticism. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a garment bag, my sister's wedding dress inside it, the one she'd chosen after I'd canceled my wedding, the one she'd be wearing to marry my former fiancé on my former wedding date. I took the dress and thanked her warmly, said how grateful Melissa would be that this had been resolved so easily. The consultant smiled, relieved that the interaction had gone smoothly, and I walked out of the boutique with my sister's wedding dress in my hands and a sense of calm purpose that felt almost meditative. I didn't damage the dress. That would have been petty, obvious, the kind of revenge that's satisfying for about 30 seconds before you realize it's made you into exactly the person they've been saying you are. Instead, I took it to a seamstress in the next town over, someone who had no connection to our family or the wedding, and I asked her to make very subtle alterations. Take the hem up by 1/2 inch on one side. Adjust the bust slightly unevenly. Modifications that wouldn't be noticeable on the hanger, but would make the dress pull wrong when worn, make it uncomfortable, make the bride feel like something was off even if she couldn't identify exactly what. The seamstress looked at me with knowing eyes and didn't ask questions. She'd been doing this for 40 years, she said, and she recognized the energy of a woman who'd been wronged. She charged me half her usual rate and had the modifications done in 2 days. Careful work that looked entirely natural. And when she handed the dress back to me, she said, "Whatever happened to you, honey, I hope this helps even the scales a little bit." I returned the dress to the bridal shop with a story about the misunderstanding being resolved, and the consultant hung it back up without checking it closely, probably relieved the whole situation was over. Melissa would pick it up 3 days before the wedding and wouldn't try it on again until the day itself, too busy with other preparations,
too confident in her perfection to imagine anything could be wrong. But the dress was just the beginning, just the small theatrical flourish. The real work was happening elsewhere, in conversations I was having with people Melissa had hurt over the years, in evidence I was gathering about financial inconsistencies in the wedding planning, in the careful documentation of every lie she had told to cover up the affair. Marcus introduced me to two other men Melissa had dated, and subsequently destroyed, both of them eager to share their stories once they realized someone was finally listening. There was Jason, who dated her in college and found out she'd been sleeping with his roommate while planning their future together. There was Chris, who'd lent her money for what she said was her mother's medical emergency, only to see her post photos from a luxury vacation the same week. Each of them had pieces of the puzzle, evidence of a pattern that went back years. And together, we built a picture of someone who'd made a lifestyle of taking what didn't belong to her and rewriting history so she always emerged as the victim. I created a website, nothing dramatic, nothing vengeful in tone, just a simple site with a neutral name that laid out facts in chronological order. Screenshots of text messages with dates and timestamps, photos that proved timelines, testimony from people Melissa had hurt, all of them willing to go on record with their real names and contact information. I didn't editorialize, didn't add commentary, just let the evidence speak for itself. The URL was simple, memorable, and at the bottom of the page, I included one line: "Sometimes the truth takes time to surface, but it always does eventually." 3 days before the wedding, I sent the link to everyone on the wedding guest list, not as a mass email that could be ignored or filtered, but as individual messages personalized to each person, mentioning our connection, asking them to look at something important before they celebrated a marriage built on deception. I sent it to David's parents, who'd always been kind to me and who I knew had traditional values about honesty and family. I sent it to Melissa's friends from college, many of whom had their own complicated histories with her that they'd buried for the sake of maintaining the friendship. I sent it to our extended family members, the aunts and uncles who'd watched us grow up and thought they knew who we were. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone started ringing within an hour, but I didn't answer. I'd said what I needed to say, presented the evidence I'd gathered, and now the truth could do its own work. David's mother called my mother, and my mother called me screaming about how I was destroying my sister's happiness out of jealousy, how I was proving everyone right about my instability. I listened to her voicemail once and then deleted it, feeling nothing but a distant sadness that she still couldn't see, still chose Melissa's version of events, even when confronted with documented proof. The wedding venue called Melissa 2 days before the ceremony to inform her that upon review of the ethical concerns that had been brought to their attention, they would no longer be hosting the event. Their reputation, they said, couldn't be associated with the kind of situation that had been described to them by multiple sources. Other vendors followed suit, the caterer, florist, and photographer, all finding reasons to cancel their contracts, citing moral clauses or scheduling conflicts or sudden emergencies. It was like watching dominoes fall, each one triggering the next, the elaborate structure Melissa had built on top of my ruins suddenly collapsing under the weight of its own foundation of lies. David called me for the first time in months. His voice was cold, tight with controlled rage, and he said I'd gone too far, that I'd ruined everything, that I hope I was happy, destroying people's lives. I let him finish his rant, and then I said, very calmly, I didn't destroy anything. I just showed you who you really are. What you do with that information is up to you. Then I hung up before he could respond, and I blocked his number with a sense of finality that felt like closing a book I'd been forced to read for too long. If you've walked this far with me, you know pain can build or break us. Tell me in the comments, what did life teach you about betrayal and forgiveness? Subscribe if you believe stories can heal, because this space is for survivors.
The wedding didn't happen, at least not on July 15th at the venue with all the guests and the carefully planned celebration. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Melissa and David had a small ceremony at the courthouse 3 weeks later. Just them and 2 witnesses they'd pulled in from the street. No family present because the family had fractured along lines that couldn't be easily repaired. My mother attended, I learned later, and cried through the entire 5-minute proceeding. though whether from joy or grief or disappointment, nobody could quite tell. The website stayed up for 2 months before I took it down. By then, it didn't matter anymore. The truth had spread through our social circles and extended family like water finding cracks in concrete. Inevitable and thorough and impossible to contain. People who defended Melissa initially started asking questions, started looking at old situations through new lenses, started realizing that maybe the common denominator in all her drama and conflicts and betrayals wasn't everyone else, it was her. Some people were angry at me for exposing everything so publicly. They said I should have handled it privately, that airing family business like that was cruel, that I'd been vindictive and unforgiving and had taken my revenge too far. These were usually the same people who told me I was overreacting when I'd first discovered the affair, who'd suggested I forgive and forget and move on with grace. I realized that grace, to these people, meant silence, meant making myself smaller so others could be comfortable, meant accepting injustice with a smile because speaking truth was considered more offensive than living a lie. But there were others, more than I'd expected, who reached out privately to thank me. Women, mostly, who'd had their own experiences with betrayal and gaslighting, who'd been told they were crazy or jealous or oversensitive when they'd tried to speak up about things that were objectively wrong. They said seeing me refuse to be erased had given them courage to examine their own situations, to stop accepting narratives that didn't match reality, to understand that protecting yourself isn't the same thing as being vengeful. David's architectural firm quietly let him go 3 months after the courthouse wedding. They cited budget cuts and project completions, but I knew the truth through industry contacts I'd maintained. Reputation matters in fields where trust is everything, and David had demonstrated a pattern of deception that made clients nervous. He found work eventually at a smaller firm in another state, and he and Melissa moved away from our town with a speed that suggested escape rather than adventure. My mother and I didn't speak for almost a year. She'd chosen her side, had defended Melissa through everything, had called me dramatic and cruel and ungrateful for refusing to accept what had happened and move on quietly. The distance hurt in a way I hadn't expected. A dull ache that never quite went away. But I also found a strange peace in it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn her approval, wasn't measuring myself against Melissa and finding myself wanting, wasn't contorting myself into shapes that might finally be enough. I started therapy during this time, something I probably should have done months earlier, but had been too proud or too numb to pursue. My therapist was a woman in her 60s with gray hair she wore in a long braid and eyes that saw through every defense mechanism I tried to deploy. She asked me early on what I'd wanted to achieve with the website, with the exposure, with the systematic dismantling of Melissa's wedding plans. I told her I'd wanted justice, wanted the truth to matter, wanted someone to acknowledge that what had been done to me was wrong. She nodded and was quiet for a long moment before asking, "And did it work? Do you feel better now?" I'd opened my mouth to say yes automatically, to defend my actions and explain how necessary they had been. But the words caught in my throat, because the honest answer was more complicated than that. I felt vindicated, yes. I felt like I'd reclaimed some power, some sense of control over a situation that had left me feeling helpless. But better? That was harder to quantify. The truth was that revenge, even justified revenge, doesn't heal you the way you think it will. It satisfies something primal, that need to balance the scales, to make sure wrongdoing has consequences. But it doesn't undo the betrayal, doesn't erase the months of pain, doesn't give you back the future you'd imagined. I'd won, in a sense, had made sure Melissa and David couldn't just rewrite history and pretend their happiness hadn't been built on my ruins. But I still woke up alone in my studio apartment, still carried the weight of broken trust, still flinched sometimes when I thought about how thoroughly I'd been deceived by the two people I loved most. My therapist helped me understand that both things could be true simultaneously. I could be glad I spoke up, glad I refused to be silenced, and also acknowledge that the process had taken something from me, had required me to become harder in ways that maybe I'd never fully soften again. She said trauma changes us, that betrayal rewires something fundamental about how we trust and hope and believe in other people, and that healing wasn't about getting back to who I was before, It was about learning to live with who I'd become after. I got a job eventually, in marketing again, at a small agency that specialized in nonprofits and community organizations. The work was meaningful in ways my previous corporate job hadn't been, and I found unexpected fulfillment in helping tell stories for people who were trying to make the world slightly better. My boss was a woman who'd rebuilt her own life after a divorce, and she had that particular understanding that comes from lived experience, the knowledge that sometimes you have to fall completely apart before you can reconstruct yourself into something stronger. Money was still tight, and my studio apartment was still small and not quite warm enough in winter, but I stopped seeing it as temporary, stopped waiting for my real life to begin once I'd accumulated enough resources or healed enough from the past. This was my real life, right now, in all its imperfect messiness, and there was something freeing about accepting that instead of constantly reaching for some future version of myself who had everything figured out. I started running in the mornings, something I'd never done before, partly for exercise, but mostly because I needed something that was entirely mine, something that had nothing to do with my past or my family or the person I used to be when I thought I knew how my story would unfold. There was a trail near my apartment that wound through a small park, and I'd go there at sunrise when the light was soft and the air was cool, and I could move through space without thinking about anything except the rhythm of my breathing and the sound of my feet hitting the pavement. It was on one of those morning runs, about 18 months after everything had fallen apart, that I ran into Marcus. Literally ran into him, rounding a corner too fast and nearly colliding before we both stopped short, recognition and surprise registering simultaneously. We stood there catching our breath, and he smiled in a way that was both sheepish and warm, and he said it was good to see me, that he'd been wondering how I was doing. We fell into step together naturally, our paces matching without effort, and we talked while we ran about small things, neutral things, the weather and the trail, and whether the new coffee shop on Main Street was worth trying. It felt easy in a way I hadn't expected, comfortable without being loaded with history or expectation. When we finished our run, he asked if I wanted to grab that coffee sometime, just as friends, just to talk. And I found myself saying yes before I'd fully processed the decision. That coffee turned into regular running partnerships, which turned into dinners, which turned into something I couldn't quite name, but that felt healthy and honest and built on truth rather than omission. Marcus had his own healing work, had his own therapy and processing and coming to terms with who he was after being betrayed. We understood each other in ways that people who haven't been through similar experiences couldn't quite grasp. And there was relief in not having to explain or justify or defend my choices to someone who'd made similar ones. We didn't rush anything, both of us too aware of how quickly things could turn complicated, how easy it was to mistake shared trauma for genuine connection. But over months, we built something that felt solid, that felt like it could withstand scrutiny, that wasn't about filling empty spaces, but about two whole people choosing to walk forward together.
2 years after the wedding that never happened, I received a letter from Melissa. Not a text or an email, but an actual handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery, my name and address written in her distinctive, looping handwriting that I recognize anywhere. I held it for 3 days before opening it, turning it over in my hands each evening, trying to decide if I wanted to know what she had to say or if the silence between us had finally become more comfortable than communication. When I finally opened it, the words surprised me. There was no justification, no attempt to rewrite what had happened, no request for forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, she wrote about consequence, about how the life she'd built with David had crumbled in ways she hadn't anticipated, how trust between them had corroded once they'd realized their relationship was founded on betrayal, and therefore could never fully trust each other not to do the same thing again. She wrote about loneliness, about how cutting people off to protect her narrative had left her isolated, about how she'd look at her phone and realize she had no one to call who wasn't somehow connected to maintaining the fiction she'd created. She didn't apologize, not directly, but there was acknowledgement in the letter that I hadn't expected. A
A recognition that what she'd done had been wrong, not just because it had hurt me, but because it had been fundamentally unethical, regardless of how she'd tried to frame it. She wrote that she'd been in therapy, that she was trying to understand the patterns that had led her to repeatedly hurt people, that she was beginning to see how the competition she'd felt with me since childhood had poisoned something that should have been sacred. The letter ended with a simple statement: I don't expect you to respond to this. I don't expect anything from you anymore. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything, and I'm sorry it took me this long to admit it. I folded the letter carefully and put it in a box in my closet, along with other artifacts from that period of my life: the wedding invitation and the website printouts and the photos of me in the dress I'd never worn. I didn't respond because she was right. She didn't deserve a response. But I also found that reading her words had released something in me I hadn't realized I was still holding. Anger, maybe, or the need for acknowledgement, or the hope that someone in my family would finally see the situation clearly. My mother called a few weeks after the letter arrived. Melissa must have told her she'd written to me, must have been working on her own reconciliation with family members she'd alienated. My mother's voice was careful, tentative, and she asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, no agenda or expectations. I almost said no, almost told her it was too late, that you can't ignore someone's pain for years and then decide one day that you're ready to acknowledge it. But I met her anyway, at a cafe neither of us had history with. Neutral ground. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile, and I realized that this had taken a toll on her too. The fractured family, and the forced choosing of sides, and the gradual understanding that the daughter she'd always favored had built her life on lies. We sat across from each other with lukewarm coffee between us, and she said very quietly that she'd been wrong, that she'd let her own fears about me ending up alone cloud her judgment about what had actually happened. She didn't apologize, not directly, but there was acknowledgement in the letter that I hadn't expected. A recognition that what she'd done had been wrong, not just because it had hurt me, but because it had been fundamentally unethical, regardless of how she'd tried to frame it. She wrote that she'd been in therapy, that she was trying to understand the patterns that had led her to repeatedly hurt people, that she was beginning to see how the competition she'd felt with me since childhood had poisoned something that should have been sacred. The letter ended with a simple statement: I don't expect you to respond to this. I don't expect anything from you anymore. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything, and I'm sorry it took me this long to admit it. I folded the letter carefully and put it in a box in my closet, along with other artifacts from that period of my life: the wedding invitation and the website printouts and the photos of me in the dress I'd never worn. Marcus and I got engaged on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 years after I'd met David in that coffee shop and thought I'd found my future. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, but this time it felt different. Felt grounded in reality rather than fantasy, built on months of honest conversation and shared vulnerability, and the kind of trust that comes from choosing someone again and again, rather than just once in a moment of romantic certainty. We got married at a small ceremony in the park where we'd first run into each other, just close friends and Marcus's family, and my mother, who cried through the entire thing, but in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. I wore a simple dress I'd bought off the rack at a department store, nothing like the elaborate gown that was still hanging in my closet in its garment bag, a reminder of who I used to be and what I'd survived. Melissa wasn't invited, and I didn't feel guilty about that exclusion. Some bridges burn for a reason, and trying to rebuild them just because time has passed doesn't honor the truth of what happened or the valid reasons the bridge burned in the first place. Maybe someday we'd find our way to some version of sisterhood. Maybe we wouldn't, and I'd made peace with both possibilities. Standing there in the park with Marcus's hand in mine, I thought about karma and revenge and justice and all the ways we try to balance scales that were never really meant to be balanced.
I thought about the website I'd created and the wedding I'd helped dismantle and whether I regretted any of it. The honest answer was no. I didn't regret speaking truth or refusing to be erased, but I also understood that revenge hadn't healed me. Time and therapy and choosing to build something new had done that. The officiating clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a practical manner, asked if I was ready to begin, and I said yes because I was finally genuinely ready to move forward rather than just away from what had hurt me. The ceremony was brief, no lengthy speeches or performative declarations, just simple vows about honesty and partnership and choosing each other, knowing full well that life would be difficult sometimes, and that choice would need to be made again and again. When Marcus kissed me, I felt the sun warm on my face and heard birds in the trees overhead, and thought about how I'd once believed I knew what happiness looked like, had thought it was an elaborate white dress and a venue with 200 guests and a sister who loved me enough to celebrate my joy rather than steal it. But real happiness, I'd learned, was quieter than that, more subtle, built on foundations that could withstand scrutiny rather than requiring careful maintenance of appearances. We walked back through the park after the ceremony, just the two of us, before joining friends for a simple lunch at a local restaurant. Marcus squeezed my hand and asked if I was happy, and I realized I was, genuinely happy, in a way that wasn't about vindication or revenge or proving anything to anyone. I was happy because I'd survived something that should have broken me, because I'd spoken truth even when it cost me everything, because I'd refused to make myself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. I thought about the girl I'd been 2 years ago, sitting in that studio apartment with the soup-stained carpet, holding a wedding invitation that felt like a death sentence for any remaining hope. I wanted to tell her that it would get better, that the pain wouldn't always be this sharp, that she'd find her way to something real on the other side of all this loss. But more than that, I wanted to tell her that the anger she felt was valid, that speaking up was right, even when people told her to be silent, that protecting herself wasn't the same as being vindictive. Because here's what I learned through all of this. Karma isn't some mystical force that operates independently of human action. Karma is what happens when people finally see truth clearly, when lies collapse under their own weight, when patterns of behavior catch up to people who thought they could escape consequences forever. My sister took my fiancé and my wedding dress and my wedding date, thinking she could build happiness on the ruins of my life. But she couldn't take the one thing that actually mattered, my willingness to tell the truth about what happened, to refuse to be erased, to stand up and say this was wrong, even when everyone told me to be quiet. That's the karma she couldn't escape. Not because I was vindictive, not because I was cruel, but because truth has a weight that fiction can never match, and eventually that weight crushes everything built on lies. The sun was setting as we walked through the park, painting everything gold and amber, and I felt Marcus's hand warm in mine and thought about new beginnings and second chances and all the ways life surprises you when you stop trying to control the narrative and just let yourself be honest about what you've lived through. I'd been betrayed, broken, systematically erased, and I'd clawed my way back to something resembling wholeness, not by pretending it didn't hurt, but by refusing to let that hurt define me forever. Some people would say I should have been the bigger person, should have forgiven immediately, should have let bygones be bygones and moved on with grace and dignity. But grace, I learned, isn't about silence. Grace is about knowing your worth, setting boundaries, speaking truth, and then building something new from the ruins of what was destroyed. Grace is about surviving and
Refusing to apologize for the ways you had to fight to do so. And if that's not karma, if that's not justice, if that's not redemption, then I don't know what is. I squeezed Marcus's hand back and said, yes, I was happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way I hadn't thought possible when everything had fallen apart. And walking forward into whatever came next, I carried with me the knowledge that I'd been tested in ways I'd never anticipated, that I'd made choices I could live with, that I'd spoken truth even when it cost me everything, and that on the other side of all that loss and pain and reconstruction, I'd found something more valuable than the fairy tale I'd originally imagined. I'd found myself, and nobody, not my sister, not David, not anyone, could ever take that away from me.